Hi there, gallery members and new viewers alike. Thanks for tuning in for this latest edition of Gridiron Gallery. If you haven't seen my channel before up until this point with new videos, recommend you like this one and subscribe for more. We got plenty of content on all your favorite football leagues. And for those gallery members out there, thank you as always for tuning in. Really can't appreciate you enough. Now, on to the show. Joining me today on the Gridiron Gallery podcast, I have a good friend of mine who hasn't been on this show for at least a few months now. He was on earlier this year with me talking some CFL football. But Greg James, I will say, is one of the biggest history buffs in football that you'll ever meet. I love discussing topics like this with him, and we get to discuss something that kind of touches on the past and the present, possibly the future too, at the same time. Greg, thanks for coming back on the show, man. I know we already do Gridiron Japan together every 2 weeks, and we talk, it seems like every week, at least a few times, kind of, either on Twitter or messages, but it's nice to get you back on the show and just kind of having one of our laid back conversations on a kind of a buzzworthy topic right now.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'm happy to do this tonight. The USFL is one of those topics that's near and dear to my heart, and it's just nice to talk to people who, when I mention the word USFL, I don't get either a glazed over look or what's USFL. So this is kind of nice talking. This is a nice forum to talk about because we're all on the same page. We know all what it was and what it was all about. And so, no, I appreciate coming on tonight.
Well, I think that shows the legacy of it as we dive in here. The big thing that's come up with this, as we've gotten new news this past week on team names and the eight solidified teams that are going to be playing at the central location, supposedly going to be Birmingham, Alabama, whenever that's announced. We see it's a league that, it does still have really good nostalgia for it. Whether it is the general audience just goes, I remember that weird 80s league, or you got the history buffs like yourself or like myself, I'll even count it as, they do research and go, wow, this was a pretty amazing project that unfortunately, even with the great talent, unfortunately certain minds got in the way and it got derailed in one of the weirdest circumstances in, spring football history. And the first, in my opinion, big impact, this could work with the right setup type of football league that is outside the NFL, and that's not named the AFL, of course, before the merger.
Right.
And here it is back from the dead. And it's got a lot of mixed emotions from many a people. You got people that see Brian Woods behind the project and they watch the TSL and know what that's about. And they start kind of getting a little nervous about it. You've got the OG USFL fans who you and I have talked about on length off the show, that I think they just want the legacy to be preserved and not be messed with in some way possible. And I get that. But man, the pushback has been even stronger than I could have ever imagined, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, when people talk about remaking certain movies, it's kind of the same outrage. And me, I'm happy to see that the names and the logos are coming back. But, I know, I mean, it's not the same USFL. It's just, and this sounds, and maybe other people will completely disagree with me. But to me, it's just the spring league, just with a new brand.
That is an honest take, though.
At least that's the way it's shaking out right now. I could be wrong.
That is an honest take if you look at how it's formulated, because when we got revealed about the executives and who's going to be running this thing, we were waiting to see where Brian Woods lands in this whole deal. And sure enough, he got the president of football operations. And for those that are trying to kind of ask, hey, who's Brian Woods? Like maybe you're listening in for the first time, or if you haven't heard about who Brian Woods is, he is a top executive, was the CEO of the Spring League, or at least possibly is. We still are kind of figuring that out, which is a developmental football league. Has been going on since 2017, was running in camp formats where players basically pay in to get exposure and also participate with coaches that sign up. And then they also started doing single site playing seasons as of fall of 2020, which they got in a spring version in 2021. Fox was involved with that said project. And if you were starting to connect the dots, that's how we've gotten to this point. Plus, also, Brian picked up a lot of the USFL trademarks that just never were renewed, according to what the USTPO says, which surprises me. But, you know, this is where we're at. And Brian has a track record of, unfortunately, either being cheap or not paying people at times, we have been told. So it does add to a bit of a nervous stance if you are a person that is in the know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm like, okay, well, I'm kind of still away. I'm still on the wait and see part of it. Like, okay, great. What I'm seeing just on social media and on the internet, I mean, you know, we'll start with right now, a lot of people are clamoring for merchandise.
Right.
Yeah, and what there is out there, you know, what is out there right now that people are seeing, I mean, it's the reviews are in and it's not good. But with that said, who knows? I mean, maybe there is a plan. But the thing is, nobody really knows what the plan is. At least, you know what, I'll say this about the XFL, the last version. There was a plan in place.
Mm-hmm.
When they launched the league. I mean, when it got to the point, obviously, COVID put the brakes on it. But at least with the XFL, and you know me, I give XFL fans kind of a hard time, even though I'm on their side. But the XFL had a plan. They had a merchandising plan. They had merchandise. They built, in a very short time, they built a loyal following, and we see that now. So, you know, hopefully the USFL will do the same. But right now, at least what we're seeing, it just looks like the spring league just reimagined.
It does for some. I will agree that there is that take out there. And you know what? I thought that was the case early, at least a few months ago, because we hadn't been told how the ownership was broken down or who's really running this thing. Yeah. To me, I've had this change. Now I know Woods is still on is still part of the chair or the board at least, and he's going to be kind of running football operations, of course. But he's surrounded by Fox executives on every side of him. Yeah. Which just screams to me that Woods came to the table. He had this idea. Fox said, okay, we can let you be part of this, but here's the deal. We know your background and what has gone on with you in the past. Let us run the ship. You can be part of it, but we're going to be keeping an eye on you at every different angle. And we're going to hammer home that this is a Fox property, which is what they've started to do ever since the board was announced 2 weeks ago, is that they're saying this is Fox. We're running the show now. There's no TSL part of it except for Brian's past. Right. And I don't think you're going to get complaints that came out of the TSL about, if I recall correctly, wasn't there a food issue? People weren't there was something, there was deals with, I believe, meals at one point in one of the seasons. Yeah. The big deal is still that there's still players paying $2,000 in certain instances for the two playing televised seasons, which I find maddening, even in a developmental sense, that was still happening. Yeah. I mean, I don't see people being charged to play this time around. Oh, hell no. But, you know, beyond that, I mean, I still think the jury, you know, I mean, we're still a few weeks into this, you know, we're still at the beginning stages. So, you know, I say give it 30 days to see where we're at. I mean, I think it's a good point. Yeah. I mean, when is the league supposed to start playing? All indications we're getting is mid-April. So that's what I think thought. April 15th was the only date I've heard that's like a definitive possible start. So to do something like this, kind of spring league, like, yeah, that's plenty of time. You know, obviously, you know, announcing the teams and everything, and you know, that. Okay, so yeah, there is a plan for far as what we can see, but yeah, I would say give it another 30 days. I mean, obviously, you've got the holidays coming up too. That's going to factor in. But after the first of the year, and if you're not seeing more talk about it, more plans, like a schedule, yeah, I mean, that's to me, you know, again, much going back to the XFL, the last version, there was a plan in place. There were news conferences. Right. There was a lot of, and you know what? The XFL backed up what they said. When we're going to do it, we're going to do this by this date. And they did it.
And right, we haven't seen that with the USFL, but maybe it's going to happen with Fox at the helm. I'm guessing probably it's going to happen. They're just holding it close to the vest.
They really are. Again, talking with Ben Fisher from Sports Business Journal last week. That's
great.
One thing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, by the way. But that was one thing that I just he kept hammering home, and I was surprised at it, honestly. And I really enjoyed the interview, kind of talking with him in the perspective of a news journalist that's trying to get info, but is being, I won't say stonewalled, but the source isn't really giving anything. It's trying to keep it where either we're still figuring some stuff out, or we want to be dead sure we've got things in order to where this can look as a good of a press release as possible for people to have in it. Now, is that a good tactic? Maybe, although you are running out of time, so you have to start releasing things here as you go down the line leading into next year, because now it's at the 5-month mark in less than a week. So,
well, players they're going to be bringing players pretty soon.
They are, yes.
Out. So, from there, I would expect things on a weekly basis. And again, going back to where, it is a Fox property, and, it is a network, their reputation's on the line. So my assumption is that they're going to do things the right way. They've got the team in place. They just haven't laid it out for everybody to consume yet. Because, as I always like to say, probably it's still in the lawyer's hands right now before it gets out to the general public.
Most likely. We've heard about Alabama for a while now, but that's gone quiet, really dead radio silence for a few weeks. And people, of course, have been asking, where's the Alabama announcement? They keep saying that there's a future site to be determined, but if you look hard enough, we already know it's Alabama, supposedly. But
well, the thing is, with future sites and everything, we kind of have known it's always going to be Birmingham to begin with, and they've got a brand new stadium.
Mm-hmm.
So, things are just, I think things are in that stage where, hey, they're just talking right now. They're ironing, the documents probably been drawn up. Nothing's been signed yet. They're still being reviewed by other attorneys.
Sure. Well, Birmingham did get its team back, which was nice. That when they announced the stadium's like Protective Stadium getting the majority in the Legion Field with the overflow, and in the drawn up deal that they're making right now, they did promise that Birmingham would have a team, and the Stallions are one that returned. So here's what I found was cool, and I'll go through the list of teams as we're doing this. I liked the announcement and the way Fox did it, because if you're going to do it as a Fox property, why not do it through one of Fox's biggest shows, which is The Herd, hosted by Colin Cowherd. It's one of their biggest daytime sports talk shows, one of their biggest radio broadcasted shows. And it's one of Fox's biggest, I would say, talents outside of maybe like Skip Bayless and Shannon Sharp in terms of that daytime prop block.
They would have been better off going with Skip and doing it on their show.
You think so?
Yeah, I do. I watched the announcement, and it was like, oh, by the way, and they spent 6 minutes on it, and then they moved on. Really?
I will admit I had to sit, and you knew this too. We did have to sit through a lot of talk about Baker Mayfield before we got there.
You know what? When I turned it on, I was working and just kind of typing there, and I every now in the background, and I waited for an hour. Oh, it finally came on. Like, okay, that's it. And then went back to what I was doing. There wasn't much.
Yeah.
And I was disappointed that it was just Colin saying, oh, by the way, here's what we have. On to the next subject.
The mannerism doesn't help, I guess, but I at least I'll acknowledge that they at least are using their outlet, because they're a media company, so it's good.
Right.
But when you do say, by the way, and this also ties into the fact that spring football is always under a microscope in the general public anyhow, where like any small thing, like the Pat McAfee news that came out this week, where it's like, so I was offered a job, and everyone lost their minds because it was like, oh, they're being cheap because it's Pat McAfee and he was a big time punter in the NFL and he has a show. He doesn't need this money. Dude, we don't know what he actually was said. He's just blabbing off some stuff and putting it on the show right now.
When people say Pat McAfee said, I need at least 2 other sources.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I felt like that was a big overreaction, but that's just the microscope of spring football. You know, anything that comes up, it'll get criticism, or you're going to someone will overanalyze it if
Right. Well,
it's somewhat negative or middle ground.
Yeah, we live in a day and age where that happens constantly.
Mhm.
Everybody, and even with this, I mean, we saw it on social media, where in the, as I like to call it, the virtual public square. Yeah, there were a lot of opinions about this, and some great, some not so great.
Yeah, I thought it was fine. I mean, hey, I don't know. It gets them in the public eye. I mean, I guess publicity's publicity is the best I can put it that way. But you know, that's just one of those things you get kind of amazed at, like that kind of scrutiny or things like that.
And it goes back to what we were talking about with history. You can blame the original USFL for a lot of negativity towards spring football. I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean,
there are negatives for it besides all the positives of play,
right?
That stick out.
Yeah. The USFL, the way it ended, the way it started, the way it ended, and between. I mean, we all know that's a movie unto itself, and how that all came about. But a lot of the negativity just comes from the original USFL and just how spectacularly it ended up failing.
Mm-hmm. The end result is the thing. I still like. Obviously, we're saying with the play there's positives, but between the fact that there was no salary cap, rising player expenses kept going nuts. The league wanted to go to the fall because, and I'm not pinning it on one man with a golden top of hair, but that one specific person, Mr. Donald J. Trump, and some other owners, 12-2 vote, said they want to go to the fall. And there's people that to this day argue that was the worst move that they could have made, even with the debts they were encountering.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when that league started, there was the Dixon plan, and the original.
Right.
I mean, within there are 3 good books on the USFL. I have all of them on my bookshelf in the back, and as you can see here, I've got my little homage to the USFL back behind me.
Quite amazing setup there, Greg. I love the pinwheel setup with all those.
Yeah, I've only got a few. I mean, that's about really. I mean, I got a couple hats with USFL. I've got an Orlando Renegades hat. What another one I got downstairs? Oh God, I can't think of what the other one is. Oh, Houston Gamblers one I got downstairs.
Yes.
And one of those old trucker type caps too. It's kind of cool. Very
okay.
But going back to talking about what happened with the USFL, they had the Dixon plan in place. Hey, here's what we're going to do. Control expenses. That went right out the window the first season. Now, for as much as I have got no problem blaming a guy with, who's with orange skin for a lot of things, but the failure of the USFL was not solely his, because they were blowing through money, and they were blowing through. They were shooting themselves in the foot long before he came onto the scene.
That is
now,
true.
With that said, was he driving the bus when it ran into the ditch? Yeah, he ran into. I mean, he's the reason why he convinced 11 other owners to move to the fall.
Mm-hmm.
When clearly, I mean, we all know how the lawsuit. I mean, they didn't win the lawsuit, but we all know how that ended. I mean, it ended in complete utter failure.
Right. When you give up $160+ million spring football contracts to pursue a lawsuit to win millions upon millions, you're probably not going to get the monies that you are looking for.
Right. And with that money, I mean, you have to keep in mind too what those dollars were worth back then. So, so 100, whatever they were offered, to stay in the spring it's still a lot of money. Did it mean some of those teams were going to have to go away? Oh yeah. Cause they overextended themselves to, by expanding so quickly in the second season.
Mm-hmm. I find, and it's funny because some of the teams in this list, I was kind of amazed at like 1 or 2 they picked up, because they either didn't last the entirety of their run, or they weren't in a single city for their full run. But they still chose them over some other options too. So, let's actually talk about those 8 teams while I'm on that subject, by the way, because like I said, the few of them, in terms of like folding down and condensing, they were part of this. Which, by the way, this is ironic. The first one I'll list off, the Pittsburgh Maulers. They have the biggest following on Twitter right now. But what cracks me up, Greg, and you know this, they lasted one season and folded under after 1984.
Yeah.
With 3-15, they drew a decent crowd, but because the fact they were moving to the fall in 86, their owner didn't want to compete with the Steelers. So they folded under.
Yeah.
But the Maulers are the most popular franchise, at least in the public eye, after they've announced these teams.
Well, I'd be curious to see where those followers are from. Are we talking Pittsburgh? Because if that's the case, then, if you're able to, and I don't think they're able to do it with Twitter, to narrow down where, your followers are from. But Pittsburgh's a huge football town. Yeah. The Steelers, obviously. But to me, and, just talking about aesthetics, to me, the Maulers have the coolest logo. At least they did back in the original league.
Do you like, I'll list off the other teams before I ask this question, because the Maulers are one of the 8 that they either have slightly updated logos or they're fully revamped. So I'll go through the list. There's 2 divisions that are going to be in the USFL for those that are haven't heard yet. There's the North and the South. The North Division, you're going to have the Pittsburgh Maulers, along with the Philadelphia Stars, the New Jersey Generals, and the Michigan Panthers, which are my team, by the way, closest to where I live. So I'm going to associate with them at that choice. I don't have the Chicago Blitz. I got to wait to see if they'll ever expand to Chicago. If they last that long, go figure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they do, they get a stadium right down, down Harlem Avenue. For me, that would be awesome to see them play in.
I've had a theory here because the Bears are moving. I was like, hey, say the USFL lasts long enough, we can just put them right in Soldier Field where they used to be, and Chicago can embrace the city mayor, and everyone can embrace that team and be just very spiteful or something like that. I don't know. but for the time being, I root for the Panthers in the North Division. In the South Division, here's where you're going to find the Birmingham Stallions returning, as promised. It sounded like from that discussion with the city of Birmingham on that stadium, along with other popular candidates from the original run of the USFL, including the Tampa Bay Bandits. Bandit ball is making a comeback. Houston Gamblers are also returning, and the Breakers in New Orleans. The Breakers were one of the only team that moved to 3 cities in its run: Boston, New Orleans, and then to Portland after the announcement of the fall season change for 1986. They'll be in New Orleans, where they were the most popular, and they played in the Superdome. Not saying they are now, but they were a popular hit at the time when they were in that New Orleans in that 1984 year.
Yeah.
So all OG teams returning. They even stuck with the cities, which I was fascinated that they said, here's the city names as well.
Yeah, but like with New Orleans, I mean, they're originally the Boston Breakers.
Yep.
So they went with New Orleans. But yeah, I mean, on the city part of it, I think they would have been smarter just to go with the names and leave the cities off, because for those of us, I mean, for most people, I think, whether or not you remember the original league or not, the city is implied with the name.
Yeah.
It really is. You think Stallions, okay, it's Birmingham. Stars, Philly. I mean, and even with the Breakers, we just associate them with 3 different towns. And, looking forward to next year. So, I mean, they're doing just one city this year. And the plan is, theoretically right now, them to actually be in these cities. I would just think you just leave the names without the cities. And then once you figure out for sure where they've got stadiums and maybe they've done a little bit of market research, well, then you put the city names on them.
That's possible they have. But I mean, some of the cities that they're listing here, I'm questioning, will they have the same response as they did back in the day? Now, the Tampa Bay Bandits, first off, they had the most popular team in the USFL in all 3 of the years. They drew the largest average crowd in all 3 seasons of 40,000+ fans out in Tampa Bay, Florida, mainly because of great marketing and ownership that was out in the public. Well, Steve Spurrier being the head coach and bringing bandit ball as this exciting foray into the sport.
Well, and then John Bassett owned the team, and then he had Burt Reynolds as part owner. So there was There, and also too, keep in mind back then the Buccaneers were horrible.
That's true too.
They had nothing to compete with on the football stage. I mean, the Buccaneers were just horrible. I mean,
Early days for them, you know.
The Lions are bad now, man. Buccaneers back then, it was even sadder at times. But so they had nothing really to compete with. So I think that's why it was so popular. Plus, again, people, don't really talk about John Bassett enough.
They really don't. And it's funny, he's kind of entwined in the history of spring football, and it's like kind of its popularization of what could be, because of the fact he was in the WFL. He saw how that one, and I'm gonna not sugarcoat it, it failed dramatically. I mean, it survived over a season, but it's lucky it got to year 2 plus. So there's that, and I need to do a whole show on that, and I've got plans, thanks to yourself, on someone that would know a little bit or thing or two about that. I'm going to leave that one for you guys to figure out. But he took a chance and saw the money in the USFL, and he's really the one that stuck closest to what David Dixon wanted. Yeah. And it kind of was working.
He's the one who tried to hold Trump in check, and obviously he couldn't do it. And there were he was dying of cancer at that time.
Yeah.
Had he not, if you want to go back and do alternative history, hypothetically, had he not, if he were still around, I think he was outmanned and outvoted anyway with the owners and Trump. But it's interesting to see how the league would have fared had his health not declined.
There's a documentary I discovered recently on YouTube that I gotta go find. That it's a documentary on the final season of the Tampa Bay Bandits. It's narrated by Burt Reynolds. I was like, I need to watch. I was watching the early going where they were like in a early season dinner with the team, and you could tell like he was loved by his players. Like he was definitely one of the bright spots of just the league itself, and really believed in it. That's something that's going to be needed here. But that's the history. And we talk with old school USFL guys, like that history is behind that name. So like those people that loved like that Bandits team, that's kind of where we talk, like when we talk about pushback from from that side of the fan base.
Yeah.
That's kind of a origins of that, where you talk the Michigan Panthers, the 1983 championship over the Philadelphia Stars, game-winning touchdown pass, one of the most successful teams in the USFL till they moved to Oakland. We can talk, I mean, each one of these teams has something that's rooted back to them in some way.
Yeah. I mean, each team had an interesting history. I won't say a great history. I mean, even look at Chicago Blitz, and they moved to Arizona, they swapped franchises.
Right.
And then they eventually merged with Oklahoma and became the Outlaws. The Chicago Blitz that came back to Chicago, their owner completely gave up on the team, and the team was gone, by the third season. And you've got the Oakland Invaders. I mean, when they came into the league, the Raiders had just left.
Yeah.
So they were in that void. And the Oakland Invaders, to me, had probably, much like the Pittsburgh Maulers, probably the coolest logo in the league. The coolest look. Just something about that hand with the lightning bolt and those yellow helmets and yellow. It was just a perfect combination. And then you had the Philadelphia Stars, where, I mean, there's another team that, they ended up having to move because of, they had, Baltimore had opened up, but they couldn't get into Memorial Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had, even though Baltimore really doesn't lay claim, you had, Baltimore is the only city, on the continent with the NFL, a CFL, and technically a USFL championship.
That's right.
So,
that's right. Yeah. 3 different levels of professional football championships all in one bout. And then, I mean, the Generals, I mean, what can you say? Herschel Walker, Doug Flutie, of course, the big man himself eventually running the franchise in 1984 that we've already talked about. I mean, if you're talking about the Hollywood kid of the league, that's who they were. That's their legacy, was big and brash,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the story of Herschel Walker joining with the Generals is interesting in itself, because he did it flat out. He needed the money.
Mm-hmm.
He broke. And that's why he did it. And when he signed with the Generals, Trump was not the owner at the time.
Right.
So, and then, he comes onto the scene, and obviously he bought the team. His whole plan was to try to merge with the NFL. But and this is just when I talk about the history of this league, especially in the last, in terms of, okay, he bought a team in a league. He wanted to merge into another league, of whose commissioner had told him point blank he would never get a franchise in the league.
Right.
And, at the time, Pete Rozelle, this was at the height of Rozelle's power. So you kind of question kind of the thought process there. Why would then did you get into this league? So, try to force a merger. The NFL, still a private entity, and a merger with the USFL was never going to happen.
It would have been such a hard sell if you had done it. A different time for the league too, compared to the late 60s to 70s.
Yeah. Well, back in the 60s when you had the AFL, the NFL was only in a certain area of the country, except with LA and San Francisco. There were a whole lot of cities that did not. We think of big cities now. A lot of the big cities we think now were little cities back then.
Right.
For Dallas and Houston being right at the top of that list.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Definitely was a change demographic then. And now it's amazing that still, like, we're talking how they're coming back now and trying to approach a different way. To wrap around my conversation with the Bandits.
Yeah.
Then, as Greg pointed out, and I appreciate that you brought this point up, Tampa Bay, terrible football team. No one wants to go watch, consistent losses and mediocrity week in and week out. So go find the alternative. And the XFL just recently, as of 2020, we're in Tampa Bay. And I don't know about you, but since they attached their names to the Bandits now, well, if you go to Tampa Bay, there's a really good team there. And last time I saw with ticket sales with the XFL's 2.0 version run by McMahon, they weren't getting that great of crowds, at least what they were drawing.
Yeah, the XFL was never going to draw a USFL type of crowd, and even in a place like Tampa Bay, because the changed so much. Even though the XFL is a great product, there's wrong with the product at all, but times had changed. The talking about demographics. Spring football. I don't want to say this. It's hard to fill stadiums for really anything now. And we're even seeing that in the NFL. When you look at what you see on TV, you do see a lot of empty seats. And I think we're at a point where we've kind of, as Tim Hamlin said on his show with Scott Adamson, talking about the USFL last week, I think we have reached the point we're at, in some ways, at peak football. So, but I don't think attendance figures, and this really should drive a lot of things. You and I both know you get a better seat sitting in front of your TV on an HD screen. So what really matters are the eyes, are the ratings rather than the attendance figures.
Well, Fox has definitely hinted that that's their main goal anyway with this year. And that's one of the driving points they're trying to sell these franchises with, is that they're trying to hit these benchmarks that, they saw last spring's TSL numbers with minimal advertising and went, that's pretty good. And so now they've already set their own benchmarks, and they're saying we can hit this solid viewership ranking across streaming and traditional broadcast platform. If we hit this or exceed that goal, like we did with the XFL broadcast, because remember, Fox did XFL broadcast, but was more supportive in that, not running the ship like they are now. Sky's the limit. All they have to do is get a few investors to buy in, move those teams, and say, hey, we'll get you those broadcast dollars, which is something to me that's fascinating. Is you're not trying to win over TV companies now. You're the TV company. You're the one getting the money directly to you. Now it's about trying to win advertisers and people over to your side, which is a whole different ball game than what the XFL and even the AAF were under just the last 2 seasons.
Well, it's a paradigm shift. Okay. And also too, what's factored in, and nobody's really talked about it too much yet, but it's just the gambling aspect,
Yes.
fantasy football aspect. I always say the smartest thing, not that I gamble, I don't gamble at all. I mean, if I'm going to spend money on fantasy football, I'm going to drop, I want to buy a share of like DraftKings stock or something like that. So you've got these companies that are making money off of game. Well, the only company that never made money off of gambling was Trump's company, but that's a whole nother discussion. But so you've got the gambling portion of it. We didn't have these things 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so different. The whole landscape has changed. I think Fox could make it work because they're the ones kind of in ways controlling the narrative, controlling the medium on it. And so it's I just think we're in a different age. So I think Fox can make this work, but I think people need to at least kind of temper their expectations.
That is a key phrase right there. And as again, we're talking more on the original old school fan, they know already, and they're trying to, it's almost like it's kind of a criticism / warning of saying, don't come into this expecting Heisman Trophy winners to be roaming protective stadium anytime soon.
Much like with the second XFL, the second version, they tempered expectations. They did not say we're going to compete with the NFL. Mm-hmm. And you know what? With that, because of that, they actually, I think the reviews were a lot better in terms of what was on the field, how it was presented. Obviously we know what happened with the first XFL. So with the second with the second version of the USFL, we all know it's not the original. Yes, they're borrowing the team names, but yeah, it goes back to what we were saying. Fox does have a plan. They just haven't quite laid it out yet. And I would assume, you're going to see, draft. Well, you got Caesars. You turn the TV on now, you can't escape. Every other commercial is a betting commercial.
Oh my God, it is. Don't get me started.
Hey, you know what? That means more JB Smoove with his commercials. I'm all for it.
He is great in those. I love watching those ones. And even the radio ads that I've heard, like you listen to ones like, say, pop on Spotify and you got it on shuffle. Some of those are even great too, where it's like he's doing the Caesar salad one. It's like, I created the greatest salad in the world, and now I created the greatest sports book. I'm like, okay, good tie-ins, Caesar's Entertainment.
His favorite one is him with the mayonnaise, and he
gosh.
And then he asks Cooper, basically, who are you?
That one's gold. That's newer too. That's a gold. That one's gold. I love it.
So, but like I said, we didn't have all these things back in the 80s. We didn't have gambling. So everything was network driven, ratings dependent. Well, again, so much is going to change in the next 10 years. And we're kind of seeing that. I know, for people who who have never listened to the Gridiron Japan podcast, the X League is doing something supposedly today with virtual reality in one of the games. So again, you're going to see, and that's another aspect. So, and the XFL, even the second version, even kind of hinted around at some of those coming technological innovations, which obviously weren't able to happen because of COVID. So, I think we're kind of, I'm not writing off the USFL. I don't think it's going to fail. Will it succeed? That's the question.
Does it get to year 2, Greg? That's the biggest question that everyone wants to know.
That's the $64,000 question, because not only do you have, so you got the USFL, then, you got the XFL supposedly is going to come around for a third try.
Right.
I'm still on honestly, I don't think it's going to happen the way others in our podcast world, our alt football world medium here claim it's going to. I'm not going to go here all Alex Jones and say and wrap myself around the Rock and say how great the Rock is. And no, we just don't know. It's a business decision. And you know what? The people at the XFL are paying very close attention to what's going to happen with the USFL, because if Fox can't get the USFL to work, what hope? I mean, if the XFL is going to come in, they're going to learn from whatever mistakes are made by the USFL, which is smart on XFL. And then you got the CFL, which is a whole nother issue, whole nother topic that, of a situation that really needs to be fixed real quick, or else it's going to go away.
Yeah, no joke about that. We have a whole episode on just talking about how that could get some corrections and what they need to look at for 2022 for next year.
Right. Yeah.
And that's funny because really the CFL, I know it's more Canadian driven audience, but I mean, the USFL is playing in that same territory of the year. So you are taking some American eyeballs. You're fighting for that already, at least in our country. Canadians, you can say is a different thing, but
right. Well,
it's different.
The whole market is including Canada. Cause the NFL is a big product up in Canada, whereas the CFL does not get shown on terrestrial broadcasting, but NFL games do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So TSN or they show NFL games on CTV, but they won't show CFL games on CTV, except I think maybe for the Grey Cup. And even then I'm not even sure about that. But, so you've got that, the CFL has to fix their problems. The XFL is going to learn from everybody else's mistakes. And who knows where we're at in 2023. But what I do know is the NFL, they're going to keep making money hand over fist. And there's another thing too. And you and I have not talked about this, but has anybody really looked down south to see what they're doing in Mexico?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, that league is one of the fastest growing and one of the more higher levels of football that I've heard. That's one I have to do some more research on. I keep hearing from buddies like Vince at All Football Scouting Report that's told me there's some good quality football players down south of the border. I need to check that out. And I really think that might be, that's a market for the NFL in its own right. The XFL's sounding like they're hinting that Mexico could be a play because they're talking this global initiative, much like the CFL, but at apparently a grander scale. And there's a lot of stuff at play too. Mexico is going to be a big chess piece in some facet. I don't know what way yet, but in some facet, it will be a spot to look at. Right.
Well, even just from a marketing perspective, people are watching the games everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm doing this interview on my phone. I've got my laptop up right now that shows the, we got an X-League game playing on one screen here, and I got so there are just different ways to watch everything and different ways to interact. And the football, and just from what I've seen over the years is football leagues are much like, in a way, how the military has fought wars. They're always fighting the last war. And these leagues have not gotten ahead of the curve on the technology side of it. And I think the AAF was actually trying to do that with their app and everything.
Yeah.
Obviously that failed for a whole host of other reasons, chief of which was there was no money.
Yep, that's true.
I think the way Ebersol had kind of laid it out and, kind of was looking forward with the technology was kind of spot on. Mm-hmm. So, again, we'll see where we're at for 10 years. We got the IBM, there's a matchup with, IBM's doing this basically beta test over in Japan a little bit later today on this game. Mm-hmm. We'll see how it works. Maybe virtual reality is the wave of the future. I don't know, but we'll see. Our phones, the phones that I'm talking to you on right now, this was all science fiction 20 years ago.
That's a fair point. I'm pretty much used to this at this point.
Yeah.
For me, when growing up for myself, just not to show the age gap, but I'm going to show the age gap. This was more of a just luxury product. I was like, it's fine. Like as a kid, I'm like, oh, this is cool. I just can't, we can't afford it because flip phones are still more reasonable, and iPhones were exclusive to AT&T only at one point.
Right. I remember that.
That's nuts to think about. I remember my science teacher in high school. He was an iPhone and Mac nut, and he kind of went nuts when he heard that Verizon got the iPhone, because he was like excited, but also like cautious. He's like, well, great. Well, now another carrier has these going elsewhere. I'm not an exclusive club anymore.
Right.
That was a good. I mean, that was some fun memories there. He was a good
Yeah.
teacher, by the way. As a heads up, but yeah, technology keeps moving, and football is going to adapt more and more. I imagine with USFL, by the way. I mean, Fox Bet's already been joking on their Twitter. I mean, that's going to be their primary betting drive is going to be that their own betting app, any Fox property tie it
Oh,
in. So, put it in there that way.
are they going to other apps too? I mean, it allows. I mean, that's kind of the key thing. I mean, if you branch out and let everybody do it everywhere, probably in the first season you're not going to see the returns, but as things kind of get your second and third seasons, you're going to see, a continual, I don't know what I say, but growth of, the growth of your sport.
If I'll tell you one, this is a random thing, but one sign that'll show me that a league is making progress is if A, you get past the year one, and B, and this is just me, that fantasy football apps adopt these leagues and say, okay, we buy in. Because it seems like every time the last 2 years, whether it's the AAF or the XFL or now the USFL, some dude goes to talk to like ESPN or Yahoo Sports and says, hey, you going to put this league on here? And of course they go, no, because they haven't seen any proof. If I see Yahoo Sports bring up a USFL tab in a year 2 or 3, that shows me that maybe we're getting some confidence in the general public finally,
Yeah. Well, I mean, too, just talking about that, I mean, this is where the other leagues can learn from those leagues that have failed to capitalize. The CFL, their fantasy football, let's call it sucks. It really,
I know it exists.
It exists.
That's all I can say.
Hard to find, hard to understand, but it's not on Yahoo. It's not on Yahoo.ca. And that's, you're exactly right. If you're a league and all of a sudden you have fantasy football that's picked up by the mainstream, by Yahoo, by ESPN, well, then you got something. Then, things are, so we'll see. I mean, I think we're a few years away from that, but yeah. I mean, fantasy football and gambling is kind of really the wave of the future. And, honestly, I don't understand why people gamble on sporting events, but, they do. But I remember the days when gambling was literally a 4-letter word, and and rightly so. In fact, I just talking about that, in between, right before we went on, I'm watching. I've got in the background, I've got Ken Burns baseball on. So the White Sox, when the White Sox through the series in 1919, I mean, there's a reason why guys are paid so much now. No man would ever throw a game. These guys are so well compensated for a reason.
Right.
So throwing games, they're not doing, the horror, the horror story that we saw in the movie The Longest Yard never happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just shouldn't. There's no reason. I agree. There's no reason for it in modern sports anyway.
Yeah.
But I mean, betting's for, seems usually it's for the more common man. Get a little excitement out of it. An extra piece of the game, which is why I bring up the fantasy element. It's like, that's another element that, your other companies are buying into it. If you have the other people buying into your product, that's probably a good sign you're going places. That's why I look at those as indicators.
Well, I tell you what, if Fox comes up with the fantasy app for the USFL, I'm going to buy in on it.
They should. I mean, they already have the assets. Why not just do it?
Yeah.
I mean, they probably don't have time this year. I don't want the other element of this whole thing is rushing things. So if they have to rush a fantasy app, no thanks. I'll buy. I'd rather you get to year 2 and then add that for year 2 instead of me getting a fantasy app,
But then, that other part of me is how hard can it be to put up a fantasy app now? You've got templates everywhere. You've got people.
That's true.
People that know how to do this, and you're a company, just hire, I mean, this is not like the military where you hire somebody and then they completely screw it up. There are companies out there. I mean, if the military made a fantasy football app, I guarantee it, nobody would use it because it would be more complicated and it would crash every 5 minutes. But on the private sector side, a company like Fox, it shouldn't be that hard to go and tap somebody on the shoulder. build this fantasy football, because once you've got the app up, I mean, it's all code, and I'm very, very simplistic about this, but
sure,
how hard can it be? And I mean, once you get the players and you get the list of players, you throw them in. It can't be that hard, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Hey, I'm not a coder, but I mean, again, Fox is a multimedia company. They do many things outside of just broadcasting on cable news and over the air, giving you Masked Singer on like Wednesday night. So they have other things that they have under their belt. And maybe that's how they use this, is to pull all their resources and do it this way. And I think that, that they could do that. That's a thing they could do reasonably and fairly. And that's an optimistic side to me, is that that is a piece they work out. They still have 5 months. They just, people want to see the fundamental pieces of the game sort out, which we will get coaches. We'll get the combines.
Yeah.
I imagine a draft will happen, because I bet that they will do it to look legitimate, and they'll execute it.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident they're going to do that, because again, you got the XFL kind of right there. That the XFL, I get, in a way, was successful, but for COVID. But ultimately, it still failed for what I mean. Could it have gone into season 2? Who knows? I mean, that's an argument that is better left on another YouTube channel that I've had many disagreements with over the past few months. But the XFL did a lot of things right, and I think if not for COVID, it would still be around.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Fox, in order for them to be around for year 2, they really, like you said, they really got to get it right out of the gate. Because the one thing about with all these spring leagues, and we're going back to the USFL, is the NFL is watching everything. I mean, the NFL, that hold it. Remind me about the NFL and spring football here in a minute, because I'm going to come right back around to it. The NFL takes ideas from all these spring leagues, makes them their own. Mm-hmm. So going back to the NFL and spring leagues, the NFL couldn't get a spring league to work.
Yep.
Now, granted, it was 1990. Technology was different. Demographics were different. The media landscape was different. But they kept that going for a lot of years. I mean, between 1990 and I think, when did the NFL Europe get pulled on it? Wasn't it
last season? It was 2007 was the last year that NFL Europe was around.
Right. So they tried to make it work over the course of 17 years. Mm-hmm. And during that time, you also had the Arena Football League, which, you had the Arena League on NFL. I'm sorry. You had the Arena League on NBC, which was a great product. Problem was, nobody was watching.
Yeah, which is a shame, because if we talk any other type of football, I'm a massive Arena fan, and I think that doesn't get enough credit. But
no,
doesn't it all? What do I know, right?
Yeah, and that's where I have the issue. Yeah, but The Rock. Yeah, you know what? I understand where you're coming from, but
I mean, if I'm going to be frank, I don't care to buy like Rock energy drinks or buy Rock clothes, because that apparently is a thing that shows I'm a fan of the XFL. Sorry, I believe in a league, not a celebrity. The celebrity finances said league, but I'm not a super fan of Dwayne The Rock Johnson. That's just my opinion. You know?
Well, when it's almost the cult of personality with a lot of the true hardcore XFL believers, who I give them credit. I love their enthusiasm for football and everything. But I think if you tie everything to this, one guy to save the world, and the XFL was a great product. It had a great brand. It had some great ideas, but ultimately football is a business. And hey, I mean, it's great. They bought the XFL assets for $15 million, which are, it was a drop in the bucket for what Redbird Capital is worth. I mean, they're worth billions.
And for what they bought already.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, they could just buy it, maybe they bought it as a tax write-off. We really don't know. And you know what? A few Instagram photos, and I've seen XFL fans get all worked up about, Danny posted an Instagram photo. Okay, and that's great. But, and then then I hear them, expressing frustration. We should be hearing more. Well, yeah, you should be hearing more. I agree with you. So, but ultimately football is a business, and it's going to, the NFL could not make spring football work. The Arena Football League, it was a great product, but I mean, it struggled, and it had franchise folded. I mean, every franchise in the AFL ultimately failed.
Yeah, in the grand scheme, you are not wrong.
So with that said, I mean, how do we get spring football? There's got to be a new paradigm. So maybe with technology now, maybe we're at an age now where, the technology is going to allow these other leagues, the USFL, to succeed, where, a lot of, the CFL's biggest problem is they're so dependent upon butts and seats.
Yes. Gate sales, gate revenue, the buzz terms that drive the CFL.
And that's where fan control football, I think, kind of had it right. They turned it into a studio product.
Yeah, that's its own other conversation, which I am invested in, by the way, because it is basically trying to not be as attached to arena football, while also using arena football prospects in almost every facet of its game. Sans, of course, the play calling and a few superpowers,
Well, I think part of it too. Do you ever watch Texas Six Man?
No, I have not.
High school football, 6-man football. 6-man football is awesome to watch. It's what Arena League football is in essence, on a smaller. Maybe there's something to be said by 8-man football on TV on a smaller field. In a setting where, maybe it's a 10,000 seat stadium, maybe a 5,000 seat stadium, kind of like what Hawaii is doing right now. Because, the Aloha Bowl has been condemned. So they had to move. So they're playing their football games in a much smaller setting where it's like 5,000. I mean, it's because they've got no other place to play on the island. So they've had to make adjustments. But maybe that's how these spring leagues survive, instead of sitting in a big cavernous stadium like Legion Field. And, and that was kind of the thing with the USFL back in the 80s. You had the LA Express. When they had big crowds, you wouldn't know. They were in the LA Coliseum.
The NFL even had that problem with the Coliseum too. I mean, that whole seating capacity is insane. And, I'll look at, just looking at if you look at the stats for the numbers for the 85 season for the Express, and you put together one of the games had almost 5,000 people sitting in a stadium that fits easily 100,000.
Right. And that said, so, you saw that on TV, you see it on YouTube now in the replays. So let's go to the XFL in 2001. You wouldn't know from the way, and this got to give credit to Vince McMahon and the WWF. When you watched the game, you had no sense of how many people were at that stadium.
Yeah.
Just the way they shot it. And you didn't really know how many people were there until you read the newspaper the next day to see what the attendance was. So again, this is where you look at what worked in every little league. I think something's coming. Maybe that's what's going to happen with Fox. I'm going to take those ideas from all the other leagues and kind of stir them up, and even steal from the XFL, the second XFL.
I mean, yeah, maybe.
I mean,
we're still waiting, because they say it's NFL rules, but with some tweaks. That's the most Colin Cowherd said when they were talking about this last week, and we haven't heard the tweaks yet. So that's another thing. We're still chilling out and waiting to see what they announce.
Yeah, and I'm not talking bad about the USFL. I mean, I don't. Like I said, for me, my opinion of it is I'm glad to see they're going to try something this spring, but I'm not getting my hopes up. I mean, Scott Adamson pretty much said the same thing on Good Seats Still Available last week. Now, am I a purist? Yeah, but at the same time, I know that it's not the same USFL. I like the fact that they're bringing back the old logos and kind of paying homage to what came before, but we all know it's not the same thing. And where I'm seeing on Twitter now is people are getting worked up is about the lack of merchandise out there.
Yeah, or the type of merchandise. $60 fitted long sleeve T-shirts have made a ruckus as of late, or the weird all logo caps. I don't know if you saw those. They're very fascinating designs.
Yeah,
they're not Nike or Adidas making these. It's like some other way it's like in the house almost.
Yeah. And the thing is, people have had a lot of issues with the CFL and their merchandise.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the CFL merchandise looks a lot better than what I'm seeing coming out with the USFL right now. I mean, the XFL merchandise was pretty decent.
Oh no, that was good stuff. I mean, I still got 4 Battlehawks T-shirts that I wear on a regular basis because I can't wait for them to return. They're going to come back, So
well, that's the thing. I mean, you talk about places where teams in spring leagues could succeed. Yeah, St. Louis could. I mean, because really all you got to compete with down there is, you've got to compete with the Blues and you got to compete with the Cardinals. But there are definitely football fans down there. It's a situation very much like Baltimore was back in the 80s and back in the 90s when
right. Got the Stallions there,
right.
And
when we were talking here the other day about his book on the Stallions. I mean, reference, we kind of talked about a little bit about the USFL coming up, but yeah, it was kind of confluence of events where, so you get towns like Salt Lake City. That's another. I'm surprised the AAF couldn't really get that to work, but I think weather played a factor in, probably marketing. Who knows?
Yeah, I think weather was the problem there. I mean, they had snow games in early spring, which is And now credit that was they wanted to start early, and I think I actually like the USFL's plan to start in April to avoid the winter weather and get people outside.
Yeah,
as well.
Really, I mean, you think about it too. What is the USFL really competing against? They're not really competing against football. They're really, and I'm sorry, baseball. Yeah. So in Birmingham, they're not going to be competing against baseball. Now, where these teams eventually land the second season is, to me, really going to be the question. Are they going to land? I mean, just say, for instance, let's say, if there were a blitz team. Well, if you're going to put a blitz team in Chicago the second season, where are they going to play at? Well, you're not going to play them in downtown because then you got to compete against a soccer team. Well, the only viable stadium you have is where the Fire used to play, out on the southwest side where the women plays. But it's a perfect location because you really don't have that much to compete with in terms of where a fan's going to go, because to get to a Sox game from where I'm at, and I'm only about 5 miles away from SeatGeek, you've got to go into the city. I mean, to get to Wrigley, I mean, that's a whole hour journey by L and everything. And then Soldier Field, same thing. So I think with these teams, they're going to have to think long and hard about, okay, we're going to go to Philly, or we're going to go to New Jersey. I mean, are we going to go into the stadium, in the bigger stadiums, or are we going to go something smaller? And I think they're going to go into smaller stadiums, soccer-specific stadiums, much like with what the XFL did.
Well, and you're also my final points on this with the USFL as we wrap up. I'm curious who buys first, which market goes first, because out of this list, I think, like, to me, I mean, Birmingham, I guess, already does, but they're sharing. I mean, in theory, I guess if they wanted to do the whole we have our own thing, they'd just be hosting the remaining teams that don't sell, and they could call it's like the Stallions are hosting the hub still. But like besides excluding the Stallions, and they would probably have protective field anyway. I'm going to say I think that the Panthers are the first one to get sold and get themselves a franchise, just because of the factors at play, that their area that they are advertising to. Terrible football team in the NFL, an area that's looking for a winner. If you can get that team winning right away, that helps.
Yeah.
And it's a brand that, at least in terms of social media, it's one, besides the Maulers, the next best one in terms of response that I can tell on social is the Michigan Panthers.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've got a lot of potential places you could play, including Ford Field.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not very, in Pittsburgh, you're kind of restricted as to where you can play. You really only have Heinz Field, I think, unless you go to one of the smaller college stadiums around the area. But I don't know what, not being or having really been to Pittsburgh, I wouldn't know what those are.
Yeah, I'd have to take some looks too.
Yeah, Philadelphia would be a good question. So are you going to play at Lincoln Financial, or are you going to go old school and play at Franklin Field?
You could what's the stadium that the Philadelphia Union play at? Because I could see them playing in the MLS stadium if they make a deal with them.
Right. Well, that's the other part of this too. Just talking about why things didn't work back then versus why things kind of are able to work more now. The soccer specific stadiums, you have so much more of those.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that was kind of my argument back when the CFL and XFL were talking potential merger, where my thought was, well, you're going to have to compromise somewhere. So it's going to have to be on the length of the field, but the width of the field, you could probably still work. You probably could have still a similarly wide field by going to the soccer specific stadiums.
True. That's true. A lot of questions left for this, but I mean, like you and I said, Greg, they're going to probably get answered. And you know what? I've told people I'm along for the ride. You know, I'm trying to observe this as it goes. I'll of course let you know how I feel about certain aspects as they come along, whether it's you want to complain about merchandise, you want to talk about the history of it being messed up, whatever. But I want to get to the field of play, how year one goes. And if they get to year two, fine. Then it becomes who's going to be the bigger dog in the house when the XFL apparently shows up. So,
well, and there's a lot of ifs that go into a lot of this, because if the USFL is successful, does that mean the XFL is going to amp it? I mean, is the XFL going to? I mean, really, I think two spring leagues, and much like with the AAF and the XFL, and in a perfect world, could have existed side by side and complemented each other, kind of like with what the AFL and the NFL did back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. But if the USFL does not succeed, then what does the XFL do? Do they just write it off a $15 million loss and going, hey, we're not gonna waste our time, or is there something there? I mean, so I'm not, I'm not convinced that the XFL is going to return, and I'm like you, I'm kind of like, well, I'm just kind of a wait and see. But I think if the USFL is starting off, at least tried to win over, the old guys, the guys that remember the USFL for what it was. And I think they got a lot of things right on the logos. I mean, there was, I love the Michigan Panthers logo. Imagine if there was a USFL and these were the updated logos over the years.
Sure.
This is what it would have looked like. I mean, so, but the USFL ultimately failed. But I just think a lot of people, I mean, I love nostalgia too, but we also live in a modern world. I like that they're taking the old logos and updating them and trying to bring them to a younger audience and everything. So we'll see. I mean, anybody's interested in the USFL should there's a couple good sites, the Dead Football League, where they've got all the old games, and the USFL project.
Absolutely. That is a great website. That's actually, I think that is where I got my first exposure to like really diving in, was them. Paul Reitz and company putting that all together. That's a great.
Guys who love football like you and I do, that don't do it for the money. They do it for the love of football and the love of history, for the history of the game. And to understand where the USFL is now, people really need to go back and look at where it was, and just keep in mind that it was a great league, but people the people who killed it were the ones wearing the suits, wasn't the players, because the players put their heart and soul into it.
They held up their end of the bargain at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we saw 30 for 30, small potatoes about who killed the USFL.
Good 30 for 32, by the way. Love that one.
Yeah, one last thing. The other thing I loved about the original USFL was Howard Cosell was involved with it. Even though the great story that Jeff Pearlman told us on our show, about him being on the stand during the trial. And if anybody, and I know Zach, you're too young to remember Cosell back in the day, but back in the day, Cosell was sports. But when he was with the USFL, it was at the end. It was getting towards the end of his career, and so he took the stand for the USFL against the NFL, and so that whole story about the lawsuit, and the best part about that whole story with the lawsuit is after the verdict was read, the judgment had been announced of $1. Wellington Mara reached into his pocket, because in the courtroom he was sitting right next to Trump, reached into his pocket, grabbed $1 and gave it to Trump.
I've read that from somewhere as well.
That is the best. So, I always say sports history matters. And for those who didn't know what the USFL was 4 years ago, I wish they would have learned about it, because, sports history does matter. And, that's why I love sports. It's very much about history and everything. And I learn a lot about American history through sports. So, yeah, for people that want to learn more, go to the USFL Project and watch those documentaries, the one about the Bandits, the one about small potatoes. And there's a lot of good stuff out there on the USFL. Plus, all the games are on YouTube. So, except one. There's one game that they did not televise. Probably the greatest game ever played, between Jim Kelly and Steve Young. It was
the greatest game that no one ever saw.
Exactly. Yeah. So
incredible one too. And probably one that would be a Hall of Fame written stuff of legends if it was not a USFL game.
Yeah, and I think maybe I'm wrong, but I thought I heard somebody tried to piece it together with the video that's out there. So I'd be curious to see if it's out there on YouTube or anybody.
Hard to believe, but it's like how the WFL was lost the archives until until even NFL Films tried to restore some lost footage back several years ago.
Oh yeah. I mean, the WFL obviously was competed directly head to head with the NFL, but yeah, looking at that old footage, that old grainy footage is incredible, and it just kind of I watched that, and I remember as a kid back in the 70s and 80s. So it's always I get very nostalgic when I see that old stuff. So that's what I like about the new USFL. I get to see the old logos, and hopefully get to see some more old logos if they're successful and they expand into season 2.
The USFL installed a belief that the spring football concept could survive and succeed in America, and somehow it wraps full circle once again. Greg, thanks for joining for the show. What do we got going on right now? Obviously, you and I work on Gridiron Japan, so we just dropped a new episode recently as of this show. Or at least talking right now, we have a new show out. What's on the pipeline for CFL America Radio or the 55-Yard Line podcast?
Next week, we're going to be talking the NFL Today, the original NFL Today. So
nice. Okay.
Yeah, talking that, and hopefully here we'll be talking more Argonauts history with Paul Woods coming up later this month. And I know, with Gridiron Japan, for those it is Friday evening, and right now the Rise are up over the Lions 40-3. So anybody's in understanding what that score means, check out Gridiron Japan.
Please do. Greg, have a good one. Thank you for joining in. Looking forward to having you on again, and maybe talking on seeing how this league progresses. We'll have another chat soon enough. I guarantee it. The Gridiron Gallery podcast. New episodes every Friday on your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, and premiering first, as always, at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, only on unhingedsn.com.